All right. So the first major section, 1 Samuel 22, verses 1 through 5, David escapes to the cave of Adullam. Let's begin. David therefore departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all of his father's house heard it, they went down there to him, and everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to him. So he became captain over them, and there were about 400 men with him. Now, by this time, it's becoming common knowledge that Saul is seeking to kill David, so that means if Saul is after David, then the rest of David's family was probably not safe. So that's why we read here that David's brothers and family are fleeing to where he is. They're obviously concerned about Saul's vindictiveness. So David's father, Jesse, and all of his brothers. Remember the attitude of his brothers toward him when he was on the field of battle facing Goliath? Well, now they're following his lead, seeking safety with him. So Jesse's whole household from Bethlehem is taking refuge with David in the cave of Adullam. Now, if Saul is busy hunting David, what does that mean? That means he's neglecting his duties as Israel's king. And this often happens. We're seeing it happen in our day that when authorities begin to practice abusive behaviors, that injustice really for them is a way of life. And so a growing number of people could not tolerate Saul's regime, and they're looking to David to be their leader. We're told that a band of 400 men 400 men gathered around David. Now, these 400 would form the nucleus, if you will, of those who would later serve with David when he's king. So this is the beginning, if you will, of his kingdom. Okay, let's move on, verses 3 and 4. Then David went from there to Mizpah of Moab. And he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother come here with you till I know what God will do for me." So he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the time that David was in the stronghold. All right, we'll pause there. Remember the last chapter, at the end of it, David fled to the land of the Philistines seeking for asylum or security. And so we looked at that, and we came to the conclusion that obviously was not a good move by David. He'd have to pretend to be on their side. And so David realizes this is not a good situation. He pretends insanity, and then he flees back. And so he's back in Israel territory at the cave of Adullam. And now he's looking for security for his parents in Moab. Now, how is Moab different than the Philistines, in the land of the Philistines? Remember, the Philistines are within the land of Canaan, so that's actually within territory that belongs to Israel. They should have driven the Philistines out. They failed to. That's another long story. But Moab, the descendants of Moab, came from Abraham's nephew, Lot. And do you remember? So if this is Jericho, that'd be the Jordan River. So Moab is over here. And so Moab is outside the promised land. And when the Israelites were marching from Sinai to the promised land, God told them to leave the Moabites alone because they were distant relatives. As I said, they were Moab and Ammon were descendants of Lot.
And then there's Ruth, the Moabitess. So
Yeah.
she would be David's great-grandmother.
Okay, so you're starting to see the connection here. So, but remember when Naomi and her husband, well, actually her husband took her and their two sons to Moab, and they died there. And let's see, yeah. So Naomi's son, one of Naomi's sons, married Ruth, the Moabitess. Okay, so there's that connection there with Moab. So there was good reason why David went to Moab and why the king of Moab was willing to help David protect his parents. David's great-grandmother was Ruth, the Moabitess. Let's look at this for ourselves. Let's turn to Ruth chapter 4. So Joshua judges Ruth. David's great-grandfather was Boaz. David's great-grandmother was Ruth, the Moabitess. Last chapter of Ruth, verse 18. Now this is the genealogy of Perez. Perez begot Hezron. Hezron begot Ram, and Ram begot Amminadab. Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz, and Boaz begot Obed, and Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. So David had Moabite blood flowing through his veins, didn't he? If he's a descendant of Ruth, the Moabitess. So it was okay to have a connection with the Moabites, but it wasn't okay to have a connection with the Philistines. So that's why David is going to Moab, looking for safety for his parents. Now just stop for a moment. Naomi could have never dreamed or realized that her move to Moab with her family was actually going to, centuries later, provide security or safety for David's parents. So notice how the Lord once again is directing all circumstances long in advance in order to bring relief to David in his present distress. Pretty amazing, isn't it, how God has our whole life planned out? All right, let's move on. In verse 5, this is going to be the first reference in the Bible to the prophet Gad. Now the prophet Gad said to David, "Do not stay in the stronghold. Depart and go to the land of Judah." So David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. Where did Gad come from? As I said, this is the first reference in the Bible to the prophet Gad. Was Gad, did he belong to Samuel's school of the prophets? Remember, he held a school of the prophets. And notice the timing of Gad's coming. When David was making decisions based on his fear of Saul, he did not receive any guidance from the Lord. Do you remember that, last couple of chapters? But now David has begun to behave in a wise manner again. And so here comes the prophet Gad. And the prophet told him the Lord wanted him to leave the cave of Adullam and return to Judah. So David listened. David departed and went into the forest of Hereth. We don't know exactly where that is, but somewhere in the region of Judea or Judah. So what is the obvious application here for us? We need to be willing to obey the Bible just as David did when the Bible speaks clearly to our lives. And sometimes if we make a mistake and we're not really doing what we should, sometimes we use the excuse, well, I might as well just keep doing this anyway. I know it's not the best. But notice how David is coming to his senses again, so to speak, and he realizes he has to live in a way that's in accordance with the Word of God. David wasn't perfect. And so here he is looking again to God and His Word, and here comes the prophet Gad. The Lord sent the prophet to him. All right, that's the first major section. Now let's move on to the second major section. This is the biggest chunk of the chapter, butchery in Priestville. Let's begin. When Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered. Now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand. Seems like Saul always has a spear in his hand. And all of his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, "Hear now, you Benjamites." Remember, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, so these are his fellow Benjamites. "Will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All of you have conspired against me, and there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse, and there's not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as it is this day." What do we call this? I call this a royal pity party. So Gibeah is Saul's hometown, and that's in the territory of Benjamin. All of Saul's servants were Benjamites. He accuses them all of conspiring against him. "No one supports me. I have no loyal servants. Not even my own tribe is on my side. No one has told me about my own son making a covenant with the son of Jesse." Notice how Saul keeps referring to David as the son of Jesse. He doesn't refer to his name. He just calls him the son of Jesse. So really that's a form of disrespect. Notice Saul's paranoia. Now remember, Saul has passed the point of no return. He has completely turned away from the Lord. He's hardened in his sin. And really, he is heading towards the path of literal in madness and insanity. Look at his paranoia. He is correct that Jonathan and David have made a covenant. He's correct about that. But he wrongly thinks that they're planning to lie in wait to kill him. That's not why they made the covenant. So Saul's madness made him unable to see the truth that David was a loyal servant of his. Saul thinks everyone is against him. So he's clearly not in his right mind. Isn't that amazing? Jonathan was a loyal son. David was a loyal servant. And here's Saul thinking that they're actually conspiring against him. How sinful and dangerous self-pity really is. But think about it. When we feel sorry for ourselves, we are misinterpreting reality. We're viewing ourselves as a victim and blaming others for our trouble. And we're losing sight of God's grace, His goodness, His mercy, His faithfulness to us. And really we begin to accuse God Himself of treating us unfairly. Do you remember Job? One of the things that Job had to repent of was accusing God of treating him unfairly. When the Lord finally appeared to him, here's what the Lord said, Job 40, verse 8, "Would you condemn me that you may be justified?" So when we're throwing a pity party, what we're really saying is, I'm right and everybody else is wrong. See, God, I'm right. So would you condemn me that you may be justified? And I can't help but think also of Cain. When the Lord confronted Cain, "Why is your countenance fallen?" Cain was feeling sorry for himself. So Saul has totally lost perspective. His wild accusations are not true at all. And what were his servants supposed to say? They were probably afraid to say anything to him. But there was someone else standing there who saw this as his golden opportunity. Let's keep reading. Verse 9. Then answered Doeg the Edomite. You know what an Edomite is? That's a descendant of Esau. So think of the conflict between Jacob and Esau. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul. And he said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath, the Philistine. All right, so here we're given information we weren't given before. We were not told earlier. Let's go back to 1 Samuel 21. This was David's visit to Ahimelech, 1 Samuel 21. When David first visited Ahimelech, the priest, at the tabernacle, it doesn't say that David inquired of the Lord. Now, that's the reason you go to the tabernacle. That's the reason you go to see the high priest, is because you want to inquire of the Lord. You want to discern God's will for your life. And remember, I think I have an illustration here of the ephod. An ephod was part of the priestly clothing. So I'll make copies for this. I'll make copies of this for you next week. But you can kind of see it. This is a vest that is worn. That's the ephod. And so when the priest is wearing the ephod, God promised to give the priest wisdom, and we'll talk more about that later, how that works. It had to do with the Urim and the Thummim, and those were stones, and they were used like lots, if you will, to help with yes or no questions. And we'll talk more about that next week. But we're not told when David first visited Ahimelech, we're not told that he went there to inquire of the Lord. So, did Doeg simply assume that David did this because that's why people went to the priests? Well, if Ahimelech did in fact inquire of the Lord for David, it was not for divine guidance. David did not ask him for counsel through the ephod. What did David ask for? He asked for provisions for him and his men. He lied to Ahimelech, saying he was on a secret mission for King Saul. Perhaps it was in response to David's request for food that Ahimelech inquired of God, asking if it was okay to give David the showbread, and that resulted in Ahimelech laying down the condition that David and his men have kept themselves from women. Another option would be perhaps just showing up at the tabernacle was viewed in a broad sense as inquiring of the Lord. Okay, no matter what you were there for, you show up because you're inquiring of the Lord. In any case, Doeg knew for sure because he witnessed it. He knew that Ahimelech had given David provisions. He might not have known if it was the showbread, but he saw Ahimelech give David provisions and also the sword of Goliath. Now Saul's suspicions, put yourself in Saul's shoes, now his suspicions are confirmed in his own mind. He jumps to the conclusion that seems obvious to him. See, I told you the son of Jesse is planning on retaliating against me. Now he has the sword of Goliath and he's coming after me. So notice all the assumptions that Saul is making. And it gets even worse. So let's continue verses 11 through 13. Notice, when I read these, notice how Saul just jumps to conclusions. He doesn't even investigate the matter. So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob. And they all came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." He answered, "Here I am, my lord." Notice the respect. Then Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the sons of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day?" So just pause here. Again, notice this is not a good way to communicate. Instead of asking Ahimelech if these things were true, he turned his assumptions into accusations. And as I said, that's not a good way to communicate. Well, Ahimelech is totally shocked. Let's keep reading. Verse 14, so Ahimelech answered the king and said, and who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? So, in other words, everybody knows David has a good reputation. Verse 15, did I then begin to inquire of God for him? That means that wasn't the first time that David had gone to inquire of the Lord, had gone to Ahimelech. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. So Ahimelech is totally shocked to hear that David is conspiring with people to kill Saul. Everyone knows how honorable David is, how loyal David is. Who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who is the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding? He does whatever you want him to do and is honorable in your house. Now, it is true that Ahimelech had some misgivings about David coming to him. Remember when we looked at that back in 1 Samuel 21, verse 1? It says Ahimelech was afraid when he met David. It wasn't normal that David would come to him like that without an official retinue from the king. So yeah, Ahimelech had some misgivings. And now we find out that Ahimelech was accustomed to inquiring of God for David. So this wasn't the first time David came to him, but this was the first time that David came to him in haste on a secret mission. And David didn't even have the time to take along provisions and weapons. So yeah, it didn't make sense in his mind. And that's why it says he was afraid. That didn't seem normal. So it's possible that Ahimelech may have wondered if there was some conflict between Saul and David. But clearly he didn't know that David was fleeing from Saul. And he is in no way conspiring with David against the king. Far be it from me, he says. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to any in the house of my father. For your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. Well, I know you're not going to be shocked when you read what Saul's response was. Verse 16, and the king said, you shall surely die. You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Now this is amazing. Saul violates every principle of justice. He assumes Ahimelech is guilty. So really we should assume innocence until guilt is proven. But Saul is jumping to the conclusion, you're guilty. Saul is not even bothering to determine whether, he's not even doing an investigation. Everybody's operating assumption is that Israel's high priest speaks the truth, especially when it's a matter of life and death. So at least the high priest is entitled to innocence until proven guilty. I mean, the high priest wears the linen ephod, the sacred vest, for inquiring of the Lord. But Saul has lost all perspective. He doesn't care. He does no investigation in this matter. He doesn't even bother to investigate Doeg's character. And what is an Edomite doing serving in Saul's royal court? What does it say back in verse 9? Doeg was set over the servants of Saul. So I guess it was Saul, then Doeg, and then his servants. And the worst thing is he violated the law that required at least 2 witnesses to establish a charge, especially a capital crime. Let's look at this, Deuteronomy 19. And then we'll look at Numbers 35. Deuteronomy 19. verse 15. Deuteronomy 19:15. One witness shall not rise against a man concerning any iniquity or any sin that he commits. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses the matter shall be established. And then Numbers 35. Numbers 35:30. Numbers 35:30. Whoever kills a person, the murderer, shall be put to death on the testimony of witnesses. But one witness is not sufficient testimony against a person for the death penalty. All right, let's go back to 1 Samuel 22. And this wasn't just anybody. This was the high priest. And not just him, but Saul is imputing guilt to all of the priests. There's no doubt that everybody there that day could see how irrational and unjust Saul was acting. Verse 17. And the king said to the guards who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord. Wow, he's not even hesitating to use the phrase, the priests of the Lord. Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. Saul put his own servants in a position of choosing between him and God's law, and they made the right decision. It would be one of the greatest evils to kill the priests of the Lord, and so they refused to do evil. But Doeg the Edomite, who is an enemy of Israel, he was all too happy to comply and do the dastardly deed. Verse 18, and the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Now, were they wearing the linen ephod when he killed them? Again, this is a massacre. Saul gave the order to massacre the priests of the Lord who wore the linen ephod, which was a symbol of divine guidance. The priests were responsible for teaching the Word of God. So these would be the Old Testament equivalent of pastors and teachers, if you will. Okay. So Saul is the one that gave the order. He stood by and watched an Edomite massacre 85 defenseless priests. Saul showed no mercy. Now, Doeg could justify this massacre. How could he justify doing this? I'm only doing what the king told me to do, so I'm following orders. Well, it gets even worse. This bloodthirsty Edomite is all too happy to go even further. Saul didn't tell him to do this. Verse 19. Also, Nob, the city of the priests. I called it Priestville. I always try to come up with titles that are memorable, so butchery in Priestville. Also, Nob, the city of the priests. He struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. Doeg annihilated a city of Israel, a city full of God's people, a city belonging to the priests. These people were completely innocent of any crime, and King Saul stood by and did nothing. I like the way Richard Phillips put it. He said, this was Saul's descent into satanic darkness. Saul's descent into satanic darkness was utterly complete. Another commentator, Saul has nothing left but raw power. Saul is increasingly isolating himself, divesting himself of whatever true support he could have had. He has pushed away his own son, exterminated Yahweh's priests, and repulsed his closest servants. Now, the only thing he can say is, Doeg is for me. Only Doeg is on my side. Saul is the prototypical apostate whose self-willed choices led day by day, decision by decision, to an eternity in hell. So notice again how progressively enslaving and degrading sin is. And that's why we have to kill the dinosaur before it hatches. So my dad used to always say, how do you kill a dinosaur? So I'm thinking, nuclear weapons, and he says, smash the egg. So that's the only way you can do it. Any thoughts so far before we move forward?
It's hard to imagine that one man would kill. Like, did he do it all himself, or did he have people that he just would order?
The impression is given he did it himself. He was the only one willing to do it. There was no one else there that day who was willing except for him. All of Saul's servants refused because it was obviously wrong.
You have to wonder, too, because if you go back to 21, and it says that he was there, so it's almost like he cooked up this fairy tale and gave it to Saul, and Saul just ran with it because of his demented mind.
Well, he knew what conclusion Saul would jump to, certainly, yeah.
Exactly.
And he didn't know why David was there that day either. But David knew that wasn't going to work out good, the fact that Doeg witnessed what he did, yeah. Notice how you can't help but think if Doeg was thinking in terms of revenge, too, against the Israelites. So notice how Doeg treated Nob as though it was supposed to be annihilated. It's almost like he's treating it like a Canaanite city that God had commanded the children of Israel to wipe out initially when they were to enter the Promised Land.
It reminds me of Mordecai. And, Haman.
Mordecai and Haman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Haman was like crazy. Bloodthirsty.
Here's another thing that just came to my mind, too. Saul was not willing to wipe out the Amalekites when God commanded him. And we looked at that earlier. God commanded him to wipe out the Amalekites, man, woman, and child, even the animals. So Saul refused to do that. But here, what does he allow happen? His own people wiped out, man, woman, and child, completely innocent. I mean, the Amalekites were under the curse of Canaan, the original curse, the ban, if you will. So notice how twisted Saul has become. This is what sin does. All right, let's move on to the last major section then, verses 20 through 23. Pardon me? Good point. Saul is no longer being restrained. God has totally removed his restraint. Yeah.
All it is an example of what we are without.
This is an example of what we are without God's restraining hand. Yeah. So let's magnify his mercy in our lives. Yeah. 1 Samuel 22, verses 20 through 23. Now, one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe. So David knew his visit with Ahimelech was witnessed by Doeg. He knew that wasn't going to be good. If David had only told the truth, think about that. Ahimelech and his fellow priests would not have been murdered. David realizes his culpability. He takes responsibility. He says, I have caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Now, that doesn't mean that Doeg wasn't responsible or Saul wasn't responsible, but David realizes he had a part to play in this massacre. It was his lie to Ahimelech that was an occasion for Doeg to do what he did. But notice, David vows to protect Abiathar, Ahimelech's son who escaped. Notice David's desire to do something to rectify the terrible wrong that he made possible. But notice God's providence as well. The fact that Abiathar escaped shows how the Lord always preserves his people. He always preserves a faithful remnant of his people. Out of destruction, the Lord will not allow the world's butchery to wipe out all of his servants. So God is keeping his promise to continue the priestly line here. Now, this priestly line belongs to the house of Eli, all right? But this is a legitimate priestly line. Yes, it's going to come to an end because of God's judgment, but that doesn't happen until much later. So God is keeping his covenant, if you will, with the priesthood. Yeah.
I'm confused. But Abiathar, does he support Absalom?
Does Abiathar support Absalom? I don't remember. We'll get there. Yeah. That's in 2 Samuel.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I just wondered.
If you wanted to look that up and let me know, yeah, I had not thought about that. But remember, the house of Eli is under God's judgment because of what Eli did. But the judgment hasn't fallen upon them yet. And some commentators argue that this is part of the judgment, but the Bible does not draw attention to it, and so that's why I'm not going to at this time. The focus here is on David's responsibility, David's culpability in what happened. Because David recognizes, he says, I've caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. All right, let's look at the application. The first one is a quote from Table Talk, May 2019. Saul's murder of the priest at Nob shows the depths to which human beings can descend when they are consumed by sin. Only the restraining hand of God keeps people from being as bad as they could possibly be. Let us thank God for restraining evil and pray that he will continue to do so. I think we can all realize how desperately we need God's restraining hand in our culture today. It's like the floodgates are opening. It's like God has removed his restraining hand. I sure hope that's not the case. I know the media gives you that impression constantly, but it sure feels that way. Number 2, the death of the priests also puts in bold the truth that sin has consequences that go beyond the sinner himself. David's lie to Ahimelech may have seemed trivial or harmless as he was only trying to save his life. Yet what terrible... So God has ordained things in such a way that whatever we do has an impact on everybody around us, whether we realize it or not. And when we looked at David's lie to Ahimelech, we talked about the fact that it's so easy, isn't it, to tell a lie to get out of a jam because we're trying to save our skin or save our life or whatever, our reputation. We just don't realize the consequences that can come from such lies. So let's take this passage to heart as a warning for all of us. All right, number 3. There are 2 psalms actually written by David that refer to him in a cave Psalm 57 and Psalm 142, but neither one specifies the cave of Adullam. So I'm not going to have us turn to those Psalms because there was more than one cave where David had to flee in order to escape Saul. And we'll have another occasion to look at that as we go through this book. But there is a psalm that specifically is a reference to Doeg the Edomite when he told Saul about David visiting Ahimelech. So let's turn to Psalm 52, our fourth application, Psalm 52. I love reading the Psalms once you know the original historical context. Notice the balance that David has in interpreting the situation. He realizes, yes, it was my lie that caused this to happen. But that doesn't relieve Doeg of his responsibility, of his wickedness. The caption says, a contemplation of David when Doeg the Edomite went and told Saul and said to him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you boast in evil, O mighty man? The goodness of God endures continually. Your tongue devises destruction like a sharp razor working deceitfully. You love evil more than good, lying rather than speaking righteousness. You love all devouring words, you deceitful tongue. God shall likewise destroy you forever. He shall take you away and pluck you out of your dwelling place and uproot you from the land of the living. Think of all the people Doeg uprooted from the land of the living. Verse 6, the righteous also shall see and fear and shall laugh at him, saying, here is the man who did not make God his strength, but trusted in the abundance of his riches and strengthened himself in his wickedness. But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. I will praise you forever because you have done it. And in the presence of your saints, I will wait on your name, for it is good. So David is behaving wisely. He's behaving in a godly manner, isn't he? And again, notice how balanced he is. This is a good example for us in response to situations like this. Maybe one of our sins has led to consequences that bring a lot of regret. So David is not excusing anybody, including himself, and he's looking to the Lord for mercy, for comfort. He says, I will wait on your name, for it is good. And I like the first verse, the goodness of God endures continually. So again, this is encouraging. We can take this to heart. That I know we all have regrets. We've all done things that we still suffer regret from. But notice, the goodness of God endures continually. So that's what we have to focus on. His mercy, his goodness pursue us all the days of our life. And the reality is, Doeg is suffering eternal punishment. David was not in danger of losing his salvation. Yes, there were consequences to his actions, but he knew that he was on God's side. He knew he had a covenant with the Lord and was going to be okay in the long run. But what's the old saying? An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So it would have been better for David not to lie. Yeah.
Have you ever told why was it just because he was in a panic and afraid?
Why David lied?
Yeah, is that the understanding? That he was desperate almost and wasn't thinking about the Lord's goodness, but how Saul was out to get him.
Yeah, we did talk about the fact that David did panic. Remember when the Lord had proven to him over and over again that he wasn't going to let Saul touch him? Remember when the Spirit of God came upon Saul and forced him to prophesy? Well, Saul was on his way to remove David from Samuel's house. David had fled to Samuel for safety. And so there Saul was prophesying day and night. So God was restraining him. Remember, Samuel had anointed David to be king. So God's plan for David was to be king. There was no way that he was going to allow Saul to harm him. But David didn't. We talked about the fact that it was easier for David to face Goliath than it was to face Saul. Because with Goliath, your enemy's right in front of you. You know what you have to do. You have the skill set to get the job done. But what do you do with King Saul? He's your king. You're supposed to honor your king. You can't take matters into your own hands. And so David became fearful. Is this how I'm going to live now, that I have to always be on the run for my life? I can't relax. I never know when Saul's going to come after me. So.
And his men were hungry when he wanted to get the bread. So it was other people depending on him.
That's a good point, too. His men were hungry. There were other men depending upon him. Yeah.
It's a very tangled web.
A very tangled web. And David didn't know what Ahimelech knew or didn't know about the conflict that was going on. And I'm sure David probably thought, well, I have no time to explain to you. We're hungry, I need provisions, because we're going to move on from here. Yeah. This is just a stopping point. Any questions? Any other insights into this passage?